Hi, my name is Kate Blumberg. I am the director for the Latin American region of the International Council on Clean Transportation. And I'm here from my backyard in San Francisco, California, to talk to you about low carbon infrastructure for the transport sector. I'm going to start today by giving you a brief overview of the International Council on Clean Transportation, or the ICCT. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what is low carbon infrastructure for the transportation sector. And then I'm going to get into the focus of this talk, which is charging infrastructure for zero emission vehicles. I'll talk for a little bit about passenger cars and then go into trucks and bus fleets. The ICCT is a non-governmental, non-profit organization. We work with local and national governments all around the world. We have offices in the United States, in Brazil, in Europe, in Berlin, in Beijing, China, and in India. And we also have staff in several other regions of the world. And we have projects all over the world. And the focus of our efforts are to reduce the greenhouse gas and conventional pollutant emissions from transportation vehicles. So passenger cars all the way up to planes and giant boats. And we look at vehicles and fuels together. I'm going to start today talking about low carbon infrastructure for the transportation sector, and this is a little bit different than the focus, the usual focus for the ICCT. So I had to start out by thinking, well, what does it even mean to be low carbon transportation infrastructure? And this is what I came up with. Low carbon transportation infrastructure for people, first and foremost, is improved pedestrian and active transport infrastructure. So protected bike lanes and sidewalks and paths that allow people to really walk comfortably outside to get to work using their own feet or pedaling or pushing a scooter, what have you. That's a really critical piece, although not the focus of this effort. Another really critical piece is public transportation systems. So bus rapid transit systems are a critical kind of bus system that has really been pioneered in Latin America. Metros as well are really critical systems for moving large numbers of people around. And these are really important also when combined with zero emission technologies and fuels. The last piece I would say is charging infrastructure for zero emission passenger vehicles, cars, which come with their own complications, but getting in place the infrastructure to at least move them to zero emissions is really critical. What about for freight? Well, again, urban infrastructure to allow last mile delivery on bikes, for example, zero emission zoning for last mile delivery. These are all pieces of the infrastructure that we think are important, although they're not necessarily what the focus of this talk is today. Charging infrastructure, again, for zero emission trucks and vans is really critical. What about rail? Well, sometimes, and I'm going to have one more slide talking about this, and I will admit that I am not talking about aviation or marine in this presentation at all. Why does rail only count sometimes? Well, to answer that question, I'm going to share with you a figure from a study that the ICCT did for China. One region in China was experiencing very high congestion on the highways of heavy-duty trucks carrying iron ore to factories in the region, and they decided to shift all of this to rail, so shift the entire mode from truck to rail. Sounds great. But in actuality, there could be much higher emissions that result. So the current truck fleet in China is this first series. The blue is particulate matter emissions, green is NOx emissions, and orange is CO2 emissions. China is basically right now moving to China 6 standards, which are very similar to the Proconve 8 standards in Brazil, although they will have a slightly better OBD and some other portions. And those China 6 standards will greatly reduce the particulate matter emissions and the NOx emissions if they were to move to an entirely China 6 fleet. They wouldn't really have any impact on the CO2 emissions, although there might be some that we didn't make that assumption. With the current train fleet, what you see is actually there's already higher PM emissions. The NOx emissions are similar, and the CO2 emissions are also higher. If they moved to an all-electric train fleet with the current grid, which has a high reliance on coal, you would actually see a slightly lower PM emissions, but still relatively high, much lower NOx emissions, and actually higher CO2 emissions. With an all-diesel train fleet, with the current standards in place, because they do not have train standards equivalent to the China 6 standards, you would have very much higher PM emissions and NOx emissions, slightly lower CO2 emissions. So what are the options if we're committed to this mode shift from a congestion perspective? Would be to go to an electric train fleet with a much cleaner grid where you would get very low PM and NOx emissions and pretty darn low CO2 emissions, or advanced diesel train standards, rail standards similar to the China 6 standards, which would get you PM emissions similar to the China truck fleet, China 6 truck fleet, NOx emissions ever so slightly higher, and then greenhouse gas or CO2 emissions would be lower. Why am I not talking about low carbon fuels? Well, this is a study that we did for Brazil looking at several biodiesel pathways for fuel production. This brown dotted line is the baseline petroleum emissions from a greenhouse gas equivalent perspective. And what you see in brown is the direct emissions from these different pathways. Obviously, used cooking oil, biodiesel is great. That's an actual waste, although some of it is often used for animal feed and other, but there is definitely a real benefit from using that used cooking oil as a fuel. However, these other pathways, although they're often called fuels produced from waste, really that waste has some other purpose and use that has been being used. And so what you get is these indirect land use emissions, the emissions that happen because the land needs to be used to make up that use, and you get much higher greenhouse gas emissions taking into account those indirect land uses. Well, why electricity? Well, especially for Brazil, electricity is a very low emission fuel for vehicles in Brazil, because Brazil already has a very clean fleet. Diesel, not diesel fleet, a very clean electrical grid. This is looking at buses on 3 different drive cycles. These are the typical diesel emissions. CNG, as you can see, is basically exactly equivalent. There are no greenhouse gas savings with CNG, and conventional pollutants emissions are also not lower if we are talking about P8 standards, per conv 8 standards. Even landfill gases here are actually higher emissions than electricity for buses in Brazil. So let's talk about what are the infrastructure needs to support this transition to zero emission vehicles. And it's mainly about charging infrastructure. The electrical vehicle market and the infrastructure tend to grow together. This is looking at vehicles, electric vehicles, passenger cars in the United States, in Europe, and China. And then this tiny little sliver is the rest of the world. As you can see, the charging infrastructure has grown on very similar trajectories as the vehicle fleets themselves. China and Europe are probably doing a better job at growing the charging infrastructure than the US. And that's a really key incentive to incentivize the electric vehicle introduction. Charging is an ecosystem, and there's really a variety of types of chargers that are needed. The smallest amount that's needed are DC fast charging, and we tend to think of these as important for longer trips, if on highways, etc. But there's a lot of evidence that the DC fast chargers are also used in cities and in urban charging. And then the second piece of the pyramid is public charging. The blue is work-based charging that is in a big office space, etc. And then the brown would be in your own garage in your home if you have a garage. As you can see, while the number of chargers is definitely greatest for the home, the electricity delivered is these public and DC fast charging modes are more important than the number of charging points. And work is also important. And this public charging is expected to become more and more important over time. So what other kinds of infrastructure improvements are needed? Sometimes grid infrastructure improvements are needed, especially for fast charging or fleet, large charging infrastructure for trucks, buses, etc. Those bottlenecks are really on the local distribution lines and the transformers. And maybe some of the substations might need to be improved in order to provide the support that's needed for all of this delivery of power to the vehicles. How can cities and states and governments incentivize charging infrastructure? One important way is to modify building codes to support this infrastructure. So, for example, for all new private homes, require the installation of the circuits so that it greatly reduces the cost to the new owner if they want to install their own charger. Businesses, you could require a certain portion of the parking spaces to be equipped for electric vehicles, and apartment space complexes as well. We would want to have the transformer capacity already available, panel capacity, so that 100% of the residents, if they were to purchase electric vehicles, could actually install that charger for their space. Um, Utilities, states, federal governments, cities can offer grants, and these can also guarantee open charging access and data collection and sharing, etc. Tax credits can be important. Utility rates need to be set to also incentivize charging infrastructure. Um, and then there can also be coordinated city tenders and bidding processes where vendors compete for the right to install chargers throughout the city. And this can guarantee the number of chargers, the maintenance, interoperability, all of those kinds of things. London, Berlin, and Amsterdam are all examples of doing this kind of coordinated city tender process. What about freight charging infrastructure? Um, I really feel that freights and fleets are going to be the first movers for electric vehicles in Latin America, especially these urban delivery vehicles and buses are really the most cost effective at this very moment. Very cost effective. They do actually offer a return on investment. It is a lower total cost of ownership for delivery vans, small delivery trucks in urban locations, and also for bus fleets. What you see is that the cost of the charging infrastructure really goes down as the fleet size increases. So a high volume fleet, you're going to have a much lower cost of infrastructure. If you have many more vehicles that you're charging, the number of charge points per vehicle can reduce in all cases, and the cost of the infrastructure, especially because of those upfront grid transformer kinds of investments that are needed, those are kind of a one-time deal, whereas the chargers themselves are each charger. So the costs can really go down as you get to higher volumes. Um, what other considerations for fleets and freight and scaling are there? As we mentioned, the grid to charger infrastructure upgrades may be needed. On-site renewable generation can really actually offer a good return on investment already, which is interesting to consider, depending on the kind of charging facilities that you're looking at. It's definitely something to consider for larger fleets. Energy storage and management, and also ancillary grid services can reduce the cost. So storage may be needed if you're looking to avoid peak demand pricing, depending on your charging strategy. And then vehicle batteries could actually support the grid during peak demand if, for example, there was parking at an office and the vehicles were all going to be parked during the day. Those batteries could actually be used as to support peak demand. Well, in conclusion, we really think that changing how we move is important, even if that isn't the focus of this particular conversation. Increasing active transport modes is really an incredible opportunity, especially now in the pandemic when there are less cars on the road. Taking back some of that public space is really a great opportunity. Public transportation is harder during the work from home world that we're living in right now, but it's still very much needed. But in all cases, in every case, zero emission on-road vehicles will absolutely be needed to meet our climate goals. And that includes an infrastructure ecosystem that's really critical to support these fleets. As I said, freight charging infrastructure costs down as the fleets grow, and other infrastructure improvements can really support zero emission fleets. Thanks so much for your time today, and I look forward to question and answer session. Thank you.